America boasts a shining image. It is a beacon of freedom and opportunity, the land of the free, home of the brave. It promises prosperity and progress. Its global influence is undeniable. From culture to technology, America's impact is everywhere. Its wealth seems limitless, its power unmatched. America's wealth has come at a steep price. It is a price paid in human lives, stolen resources, and environmental destruction. The consequences of this exploitation are far-reaching. They continue to shape the world today. This essay will expose these consequences, revealing the true cost of American affluence. The arrival of European colonists in North America marked the beginning of a tragic chapter in human history. The indigenous people, who had thrived on this land for millennia, were viewed as obstacles to progress, their way of life deemed savage and primitive. The colonists, driven by greed and a sense of entitlement, embarked on a systematic campaign to claim this continent for themselves. This land, teeming with natural resources and ripe for the taking, became the foundation upon which a nation would be built. But this foundation was laid upon a bedrock of violence, displacement, and broken treaties. The colonists, with their superior weaponry and sense of manifest destiny, pushed westward, encroaching upon the ancestral lands of countless Native American tribes. Villages were razed, hunting grounds seized, and entire cultures decimated. The indigenous people, their connection to the land severed, were forced onto reservations, their way of life disrupted, their spirits broken. The Trail of Tears, a harrowing testament to this forced removal, stands as a stark reminder of the brutality inflicted upon Native Americans. The theft of land was not merely a physical act, it was a spiritual and cultural annihilation. The Native Americans' deep connection to the land, their reverence for nature, was disregarded, replaced with a worldview that saw nature as something to be exploited, a resource to be extracted for profit. This disregard for the environment, for the delicate balance of nature, would have far-reaching consequences, the echoes of which are still felt today. The westward expansion of the United States was a story of conquest and displacement, a narrative often romanticized, but rooted in the suffering of an entire people. The genocide of Native Americans is a stain on the nation's conscience, a historical injustice that continues to cast a long shadow. The descendants of those who survived this brutal chapter carry the trauma of their ancestors, their fight for recognition and justice, an ongoing struggle. As the fledgling nation expanded westward, its insatiable appetite for labor fueled another dark chapter in its history, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were ripped from their homelands, subjected to the horrors of the Middle Passage, and forced into a life of servitude in the New World. Treated as chattel, denied their humanity, these enslaved people became the backbone of the American economy. The southern plantations, with their sprawling fields of cotton, tobacco, and rice, relied on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. The wealth generated by these plantations enriched a select few, while the vast majority of the population, both black and white, remained trapped in a cycle of poverty and oppression. The institution of slavery was a moral abomination, a system built on the belief that one race was superior to another, that human beings could be bought and sold like commodities. The psychological and physical scars of slavery ran deep, leaving an indelible mark on generations of African Americans. Families were torn apart, their cultures suppressed, their languages forbidden. The dehumanizing nature of slavery stripped individuals of their dignity, leaving them with the legacy of trauma and a society struggling to come to terms with its past. The abolition of slavery in 1865 did little to alleviate the plight of African Americans. Jim Crow laws, segregation, and widespread discrimination continued to plague their lives, denying them basic human rights and perpetuating a system of racial inequality that persists to this day. The fight for civil rights, for equality and justice, has been a long and arduous journey, marked by both progress and setbacks. The exploitation of Native Americans and African Americans laid the foundation for a nation built on inequality and injustice. This legacy of exploitation continues to shape American society today, manifesting in systemic racism, economic disparities, and a disregard for the environment. The sins of the past cast a long shadow, their impact reverberating through generations. The forced removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands has had a devastating impact on their communities, leading to poverty, health problems, and the loss of cultural identity. The descendants of those who were enslaved continue to face discrimination in housing, education, and employment, their opportunities limited by a system designed to disadvantage them. The environmental degradation that began with the colonization of North America continues to this day. The insatiable appetite for resources, the relentless pursuit of profit, has led to climate change, pollution, and the destruction of ecosystems. The consequences of this environmental exploitation are felt most acutely by marginalized communities, both in the United States and around the world. The history of exploitation in America is not merely a tale of the past. It is a living legacy that continues to shape the present and will continue to influence the future unless we confront it head-on. Only by acknowledging the sins of the past, by working to dismantle the systems of oppression that persist today, can we hope to create a more just and equitable society for all. The abolition of slavery in 1865 marked a turning point in American history, but it did not signal the end of oppression for African Americans. The period of Reconstruction that followed, intended to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society, was marked by both progress and fierce resistance. While the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution granted African Americans freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote, respectively, these newfound rights were constantly under attack. The South, still reeling from the Civil War and clinging to its racist ideology, sought to maintain white supremacy through a system of legal segregation and disenfranchisement. Jim Crow laws, enacted throughout the former Confederacy, relegated African Americans to second-class citizenship, denying them access to equal education, housing, and public facilities. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses effectively stripped many African Americans of their voting rights, silencing their voices and preventing them from participating fully in the democratic process. The violence and intimidation that characterized the Reconstruction era cast a long shadow over the South. The Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist terrorist organization, emerged during this period, terrorizing African Americans with impunity. Lynchings, often carried out in public and with the tacit approval of local authorities, became a gruesome spectacle, serving as a stark reminder of the precariousness of Black lives and the fragility of the promise of equality. The failure of Reconstruction to deliver on its promise of racial justice had far-reaching consequences for American society. It entrenched racial inequality in the fabric of the nation, creating a system of structural racism that continues to disadvantage African Americans to this day. The legacy of this era serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of progress and the enduring power of prejudice and discrimination. The exploitation of African Americans extended beyond the realms of labor and politics, seeping into the supposedly objective field of medicine. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, a now infamous research project conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972, stands as a chilling example of medical racism and the dehumanization of Black bodies in the name of science. Under the guise of studying the natural progression of untreated syphilis, researchers recruited 600 impoverished African American sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama. The men, enticed by the promise of free medical care, were never told they had syphilis, nor were they given treatment for the disease. Instead, they were subjected to painful and unnecessary procedures, such as spinal taps, and denied access to penicillin, even after it became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, a blatant violation of medical ethics and human rights, continued for 40 years, exposing the participants to serious health complications and even death. The study only ended in 1972 when a whistleblower alerted the press, sparking public outrage and leading to congressional hearings. The Tuskegee syphilis study left an indelible stain on the medical profession, eroding trust in healthcare providers, particularly among African Americans. The Tuskegee syphilis study was not an isolated incident of medical exploitation. Throughout American history, African Americans and other marginalized groups have been subjected to unethical medical experimentation, often without their knowledge or consent. From the forced sterilization of Black women to the testing of radioactive materials on unsuspecting patients, these abuses highlight the vulnerability of marginalized communities and the need for greater protections for human subjects in research. As the 20th century dawned, the United States underwent a period of rapid industrialization and economic growth. Corporations, fueled by technological advancements and a laissez-faire approach to government regulation, amassed unprecedented wealth and influence. However, this economic boom came at a steep price, as the pursuit of profit often trumped concerns for worker safety, public health, and the environment. The rise of industrial capitalism created a new class of robber barons who controlled vast monopolies and wielded immense political power. Workers, often toiling in dangerous conditions for meager wages, had little recourse against their employers. Labor unions, formed to advocate for better working conditions and fair pay, faced fierce opposition from corporations who used their influence to crush dissent and maintain their control over the labor force. The environmental consequences of unchecked industrial growth were equally devastating. Factories spewed toxic fumes into the air, rivers and streams became polluted with industrial waste, and natural resources were exploited at an alarming rate. The drive for profit, coupled with a lack of environmental regulations, led to widespread pollution and the degradation of ecosystems. The unchecked power of corporations came at a high cost to both people and the planet. The pursuit of profit above all else created a system where the health and well-being of workers, communities, and the environment were sacrificed at the altar of economic growth. The legacy of this era continues to resonate today as we grapple with the consequences of climate change, environmental degradation, and widening economic inequality. The relentless pursuit of profit, often at the expense of human health and environmental well-being, has left a trail of poisoned communities and ravaged ecosystems across the United States. From the oil-soaked shores of Alaska to the cancer clusters in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, the consequences of corporate negligence and lax environmental regulations are all too evident. The very air we breathe, the water we drink, and the land we inhabit have been contaminated by industrial pollutants, leaving a toxic legacy for generations to come. The Love Canal disaster of the 1970s, where a residential neighborhood was built atop a toxic waste dump, stands as a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of American prosperity. The residents of Love Canal, unaware of the toxic time bomb ticking beneath their homes, suffered from a litany of health problems, including birth defects, miscarriages, and cancer. The Love Canal tragedy exposed the devastating consequences of unchecked industrial pollution and the failure of government agencies to protect its citizens from corporate malfeasance. The petrochemical industry, with its sprawling refineries and pipelines crisscrossing the nation, has left an especially toxic footprint on the American landscape. From the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which released millions of barrels of crude oil into the ocean, to the ongoing pollution of groundwater by fracking operations, the extraction and processing of fossil fuels continue to pose grave threats to human health and the environment. The communities living in the shadow of these industrial behemoths often bear the brunt of the pollution, their air and water contaminated, their health compromised. Despite growing awareness of the environmental and health impacts of industrial pollution, the pursuit of profit continues to trump concerns for the well-being of people and the planet. The Trump administration's rollback of environmental regulations, coupled with the relentless lobbying efforts of powerful corporate interests, has only exacerbated the problem, leaving communities vulnerable to the ravages of unchecked industrial expansion and environmental degradation. The fight for environmental justice, for clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet remains an ongoing struggle, one that pits ordinary citizens against powerful corporations and the government agencies tasked with regulating them. The Flint water crisis, a man-made disaster that unfolded in Flint, Michigan in 2014, stands as a stark example of systemic environmental racism and the failure of government at all levels to protect its most vulnerable citizens. What began as a cost-cutting measure, switching the city's water supply from Lake Huron to the highly corrosive Flint River, quickly spiraled into a public health emergency, exposing the predominantly black and low-income residents of Flint to dangerously high levels of lead contamination. The decision to switch Flint's water source was made without proper corrosion control measures in place, leading to lead leaching from the city's aging pipes into the drinking water. Lead, a potent neurotoxin, is especially harmful to children, causing irreversible brain damage and developmental delays. The children of Flint, robbed of their health and their futures, became the tragic face of a crisis that exposed the deep-seated inequalities and systemic neglect that plague marginalized communities across the United States. The Flint water crisis was not simply a failure of infrastructure. It was a failure of governance, a failure of accountability, and a failure of empathy. State and local officials, blinded by a toxic combination of arrogance, indifference, and a callous disregard for the well-being of their constituents, ignored repeated warnings about the dangers of the contaminated water, dismissing the concerns of Flint residents as unfounded and overblown. The residents of Flint, their voices ignored and their pleas for help dismissed, were left to fend for themselves, forced to rely on bottled water for even the most basic of needs. The Flint water crisis serves as a stark reminder that the promise of equal protection under the law rings hollow for far too many Americans. It is a tragic testament to the enduring legacy of systemic racism and the ways in which marginalized communities continue to bear the brunt of environmental injustice and government neglect. The fight for clean water, for safe and healthy communities, for environmental justice, is a fight that continues to this day. A fight that demands accountability, transparency, and a fundamental shift in priorities from those in power. Inequality. From silent springs to burning rivers, a legacy of environmental injustice. The environmental justice movement, which emerged in the 1980s, has shone a light on the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on low-income communities and communities of color. From the cancer clusters in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, where petrochemical plants line the Mississippi River, to the asthma alleyways of urban neighborhoods choked by smog, the legacy of environmental racism is all too evident. The movement recognizes that the right to a clean and healthy environment is a fundamental human right, one that has been systematically denied to marginalized communities for far too long. The environmental justice movement draws inspiration from earlier struggles for social justice, recognizing the interconnectedness of environmental degradation, racial inequality, and economic exploitation. Rachel Carson's seminal 1962 book, Silent Spring, which exposed the devastating impact of pesticides on wildlife and human health, is often credited with sparking the modern environmental movement. Carson's work challenged the prevailing view that nature was a limitless resource to be exploited at will, arguing instead for a more harmonious and sustainable relationship between humans and the natural world. The environmental justice movement has made significant strides in raising awareness about the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on marginalized communities and in advocating for policies that promote environmental equity. However, the struggle for environmental justice is far from over. The Trump administration's rollback of environmental regulations, coupled with the ongoing influence of powerful corporate interests, continues to threaten the health and well-being of vulnerable communities. The fight for clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet for all is a fight that demands continued vigilance, activism, and a commitment to holding those in power accountable. The legacy of environmental injustice in the United States is a long and shameful one, marked by the exploitation of both people and the planet. From the forced removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands to the poisoning of Black communities by industrial pollution, the pursuit of profit has often come at the expense of the most vulnerable among us. The environmental justice movement offers a powerful vision for a more just and sustainable future, one where all communities have access to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. The fight for environmental justice is a fight for the soul of our nation, a fight for a future where all people can thrive, regardless of race, class, or zip code. Beyond the shores, American imperialism and global exploitation. The exploitation that fueled America's rise to power was not confined within its borders. As the United States emerged as a global power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, its thirst for resources, markets, and geopolitical dominance led it to extend its reach across the globe. This era of American imperialism, often cloaked in the rhetoric of manifest destiny and the white man's burden, saw the United States intervene militarily, economically, and politically in the affairs of nations across Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a turning point in America's global ambitions. The war, ostensibly fought to liberate Cuba from Spanish colonialism, resulted in the United States acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as territories. The Philippines, in particular, became a flashpoint for American imperial ambitions, as the United States fought a brutal and protracted war against Filipino independence fighters who resisted American rule. The Philippine-American War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and exposed the brutal realities of American imperialism. The acquisition of overseas territories marked a new chapter in American history, one in which the United States assumed the mantle of an imperial power, ruling over millions of people who had no say in their own governance. This expansionist impulse was driven by a complex mix of economic interests, strategic calculations, and a belief in American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States had a unique mission to spread its values and institutions around the world. This sense of mission, often intertwined with racist and paternalistic attitudes toward non-Western peoples, served to justify American interventions in the affairs of other nations. The legacy of American imperialism continues to cast a long shadow over the globe. From the ongoing struggle for self-determination in Puerto Rico to the enduring resentment over U.S. military interventions in Latin America, the consequences of America's imperial past continue to shape its relationships with nations around the world. The United States, for all its talk of freedom and democracy, has often acted as a force for instability and oppression in its dealings with weaker nations. Its actions driven by a complex mix of idealism, self-interest, and a dangerous sense of its own righteousness. The shadow of intervention. Coups, dictators, and the quest for resources. The Cold War, which pitted the United States against the Soviet Union in a global struggle for ideological and geopolitical dominance, provided fertile ground for American interventionism. The United States, viewing the world through the lens of the domino theory, the belief that the fall of one nation to communism would inevitably lead to the fall of others, sought to contain the spread of Soviet influence by any means necessary. This often meant supporting authoritarian regimes, even those with abysmal human rights records, if they were deemed to be anti-communist. In the process, the United States propped up dictators, undermined democratically elected governments, and fueled civil wars and regional instability, all in the name of fighting communism. Latin America, long viewed by the United States as its backyard, became a primary target of U.S. interventionism during the Cold War. From the CIA-orchestrated coup that overthrew democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala in 1954, to the decades-long support for the brutal dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, the United States repeatedly intervened in the region, often with devastating consequences for human rights and democratic institutions. The reasons for these interventions were complex, often driven by a mix of Cold War paranoia, economic interests, and a desire to maintain U.S. hegemony in the region. The Middle East, with its vast oil reserves and strategic importance as a crossroads between East and West, became another focal point of U.S. interventionism during the Cold War and beyond. The United States played a key role in the creation of Israel in 1948, a move that has had far-reaching consequences for the region. The U.S. has also been deeply involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, providing unwavering support to Israel, often at the expense of Palestinian rights. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, launched on the false premise that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, is perhaps the most glaring example of the disastrous consequences of U.S. interventionism in the region. The United States' long history of interventionism has left a trail of broken nations, shattered lives, and enduring resentment across the globe. From the killing fields of Cambodia to the ravaged streets of Baghdad, the human cost of America's quest for global dominance is immeasurable. The United States, for all its pronouncements about freedom and democracy, has often acted as a force for instability and oppression, its actions driven by a dangerous mix of hubris, self-interest, and a misguided belief in its own righteousness. The pursuit of economic interests has been a driving force behind American foreign policy from the nation's earliest days. The desire for access to raw materials, markets for American goods, and investment opportunities has led the United States to intervene in the affairs of other nations, often propping up corrupt regimes and exploiting the labor and resources of developing countries. This economic imperialism, often less visible than overt military intervention, has had a profound and often devastating impact on the lives of millions of people around the world. The term banana republic was coined to describe the Central American nations that were dominated by U.S. fruit companies, such as United Fruit Company, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These companies, with the backing of the U.S. government, exerted enormous influence over the governments of these countries, often dictating economic policies and even orchestrating coups to protect their interests. The legacy of this exploitation is still felt today in the region's persistent poverty, inequality, and political instability. The Middle East, with its vast oil reserves, has been a particular target of U.S. economic and geopolitical interests. The United States has long sought to secure access to the region's oil, viewing it as a vital national interest. This has led to close ties with oil-rich monarchies such as Saudi Arabia, despite their abysmal human rights records. The U.S. has also intervened militarily in the region, most notably in Iraq, in an effort to protect its interests and maintain its dominance over the global oil market. These interventions have had devastating consequences, fueling violence, instability, and resentment throughout the region. The pursuit of economic gain has often trumped concerns for human rights, democracy, and environmental protection in American foreign policy. The United States has a long history of supporting authoritarian regimes, turning a blind eye to human rights abuses, and prioritizing corporate profits over the well-being of people and the planet. This legacy of economic exploitation, often intertwined with military intervention and political manipulation, continues to shape the global landscape, contributing to inequality, conflict, and environmental degradation. The deafening roar of fighter jets, the staccato bursts of automatic gunfire, the earth-shattering explosions that rip through buildings and lives. These are the sounds of a world embroiled in conflict, a world awash in weapons, many of them made in America. The United States, with its sprawling military-industrial complex and its position as the world's leading arms exporter, plays a pivotal role in arming both sides of conflicts across the globe, profiting from a cycle of violence that has left countless lives shattered and entire regions destabilized. The American arms trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry, one that employs thousands of people and generates enormous profits for defense contractors and their shareholders. These companies, with their powerful lobbying arms and their close ties to government officials, exert a powerful influence on U.S. foreign policy, often pushing for increased military spending and a more militaristic approach to international relations. The revolving door between the Pentagon and the defense industry ensures that there is a steady stream of individuals with a vested interest in maintaining America's position as the world's leading arms supplier. The United States justifies its role as the world's leading arms dealer by arguing that it is essential for maintaining global stability and deterring aggression. However, critics argue that the proliferation of weapons, particularly sophisticated weaponry, has the opposite effect, making conflicts more likely and more deadly. The flow of weapons into conflict zones often serves to prolong fighting, exacerbate human suffering, and undermine the prospects for peace. The American arms trade is not simply a matter of supplying weapons to allies and partners. It also involves selling arms to regimes with dubious human rights records and to non-state actors, including militias and terrorist groups. These weapons often end up being used against civilians, fueling human rights abuses and contributing to a climate of fear and instability. The United States, by turning a blind eye to the end users of its weapons, bears some responsibility for the atrocities committed with them. The Cold War, with its ideological battles and proxy wars fought on distant battlefields, provided fertile ground for the expansion of the American arms trade. The United States, seeking to contain the spread of communism, armed and supported allies and proxies around the world, often with little regard for the human consequences. From the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, American weapons fueled conflicts that claimed millions of lives and left a legacy of violence and instability that continues to this day. The end of the Cold War did little to dampen the global arms trade. In fact, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to a surplus of weapons on the market, many of which found their way into the hands of warlords, militias, and criminal organizations. The United States, despite its rhetoric about promoting peace and democracy, continued to sell weapons to anyone with the cash to pay for them, fueling conflicts in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The global arms trade has become a vast and shadowy network, one that operates with little transparency or accountability. Weapons are often sold through intermediaries and shell companies, making it difficult to track their ultimate destination. This lack of transparency allows unscrupulous arms dealers to circumvent international arms embargoes and funnel weapons to rogue regimes and terrorist organizations. The proliferation of small arms and light weapons, in particular, has had a devastating impact on communities around the world. These weapons, cheap, portable, and easy to use, have become the tools of choice for criminals, gangs, and militias, fueling violence, crime, and instability. The United States, as the world's leading exporter of small arms, bears a heavy responsibility for addressing this global scourge. Section 3. The human cost of perpetual conflict, a cycle of violence and displacement. The human toll of the global arms trade is immeasurable. Behind the cold statistics of casualties and displaced persons lie countless stories of shattered lives, broken families, and communities torn apart by violence. The physical and psychological scars of war can linger for generations, fueling cycles of poverty, trauma, and instability. The use of explosive weapons, particularly in densely populated areas, has a devastating impact on civilians. These weapons, designed to inflict maximum damage over a wide area, often kill and injure indiscriminately, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The survivors of these attacks often face lifelong disabilities, psychological trauma, and the loss of their homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. The displacement of civilians fleeing conflict is another tragic consequence of the global arms trade. Millions of people around the world have been forced from their homes by violence, seeking refuge in neighboring countries or in overcrowded and under-equipped refugee camps. These displaced populations often face dire living conditions, lack of access to basic necessities, and the constant threat of disease, exploitation, and further violence. The international community has a responsibility to address the root causes of conflict, to promote peaceful resolution to disputes, and to hold those who profit from war accountable for their actions. This includes cracking down on the illicit arms trade, strengthening international arms control agreements, and promoting sustainable development and economic opportunity in conflict-prone regions. The United States, as the world's leading military power and arms exporter, has a particular responsibility to lead the way in building a more peaceful and just world. This means rethinking its role as the world's policeman, prioritizing diplomacy and development over military intervention, and using its influence to promote human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It also means acknowledging the role that the American arms trade plays in fueling conflict and instability around the world, and taking concrete steps to curb the flow of weapons into irresponsible hands. America, the land of opportunity, the beacon of hope for the world, or so the story goes. But behind the gleaming facade of prosperity lies a stark reality, a nation increasingly divided between the haves and the have-nots, where the gap between rich and poor yawns wider with each passing year. This economic inequality, a direct result of centuries of exploitation, has eroded the very fabric of American society, undermining its social contract and casting a long shadow over its future. For decades, the fruits of economic growth have been enjoyed by a select few at the top, while wages for the majority of Americans have stagnated or even declined. The rise of globalization, automation, and the decline of unions have all contributed to this trend, shifting power away from workers and towards corporations and the wealthy elite. The result is a system rigged in favor of the already affluent, where the rich get richer and the poor are left further and further behind. This concentration of wealth at the top has had a corrosive effect on American democracy. The wealthy elite, with their vast fortunes and their outsized influence on the political process, are able to shape policies that benefit their interests at the expense of the common good. From tax cuts for the rich to deregulation of industries that harm the environment and exploit workers, the wealthy wield their power to maintain a system that keeps them on top, regardless of the consequences for the rest of society. The consequences of this economic inequality are far-reaching and profound. As the gap between rich and poor widens, so too does the gap in opportunity. Access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and even basic necessities like food and clean water becomes increasingly out of reach for those at the bottom of the economic ladder. This creates a vicious cycle of poverty and despair, where children are born into disadvantage and struggle to break free from the grip of economic hardship. The American dream, that cherished ideal of upward mobility, of hard work being rewarded with a better life, has become increasingly elusive for many Americans. As economic inequality has soared, so too has economic segregation, with the wealthy retreating into their own enclaves, insulated from the struggles of the less fortunate. This growing divide is not merely about income disparities. It is about a fundamental fracturing of the social fabric, a loss of shared experience and common purpose that threatens the very soul of the nation. In cities and towns across America, the wealthy and the poor live increasingly separate lives. They attend different schools, shop at different stores, worship at different churches, and even breathe different air and drink different water. This segregation by income creates a self-reinforcing cycle of inequality, as children growing up in impoverished neighborhoods are denied access to the same opportunities as their more affluent peers. The erosion of the middle class, that once mighty engine of economic growth and social mobility, is perhaps the most worrying symptom of America's growing economic divide. As good-paying jobs disappear, outsourced to lower-wage countries or replaced by automation, more and more Americans find themselves struggling to make ends meet, trapped in a cycle of low-wage work, debt, and financial insecurity. The American dream for them has become a distant and increasingly unattainable goal. This growing economic inequality has fueled a sense of resentment and anger, a feeling that the system is rigged against ordinary Americans. This anger has manifested itself in different ways, from the rise of populist political movements to protests against economic injustice and racial inequality. The Occupy Wall Street movement, with its rallying cry of "We are the 99%, gave voice to the growing frustration of Americans who feel left behind by an economic system that no longer works for them. The consequences of ignoring this growing economic divide are dire. A nation so sharply divided along economic lines cannot long endure. The social contract, that unwritten agreement that binds a society together, is frayed and at risk of unraveling. Unless America addresses the root causes of economic inequality and creates a more just and equitable society, it risks becoming a nation permanently divided, its promise of opportunity and prosperity nothing more than a cruel illusion. The story of America is a complex and often contradictory one, a tapestry woven from threads of idealism and greed, of progress and exploitation. From the arrival of the first European colonists to the rise of its global dominance, the United States has been shaped by a relentless pursuit of wealth and power. A pursuit that has often come at a steep cost to the most vulnerable among us, both at home and abroad. The legacy of this exploitation continues to cast a long shadow over the nation, manifesting in systemic racism, economic inequality, environmental degradation, and a foreign policy too often driven by self-interest, rather than a commitment to human rights and global justice. The genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental racism that has poisoned communities of color, these are not just chapters in a distant past. They are the foundation upon which modern America is built. The consequences of these injustices are all around us, evident in the racial wealth gap, the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, the health disparities that plague marginalized communities, and the ongoing struggle for environmental justice. The United States has made strides in addressing its history of exploitation. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBTQ+ rights movement, and the environmental justice movement have all challenged the status quo, demanding equality and justice for all. Yet, the forces of exploitation, of greed, and of indifference to human suffering remain powerful, often operating in more subtle and insidious ways. The rise of corporate power, the influence of money in politics, and the persistence of systemic racism continue to undermine the promise of equal opportunity and justice for all. The United States, for all its wealth and power, remains a nation grappling with its demons, struggling to live up to its founding ideals. The task before us is not to shy away from this difficult history, but to confront it head-on, to acknowledge the ways in which the past continues to shape the present, and to work tirelessly to create a more just and equitable future for all. This requires a fundamental shift in perspective, a recognition that the pursuit of profit and power must be tempered by a commitment to social justice, environmental sustainability, and a foreign policy grounded in diplomacy, human rights, and the rule of law. Building a more just and equitable society requires a multi-pronged approach, one that addresses the systemic inequalities that have been allowed to fester for far too long. This includes investing in quality education for all children, regardless of zip code, reforming a criminal justice system that disproportionately targets people of color, enacting policies that promote economic opportunity and reduce the gap between rich and poor, and transitioning to a clean energy economy that creates jobs while protecting the environment. Creating a more just and equitable world requires the United States to rethink its role as a global superpower. This means moving away from a foreign policy based on military interventionism and toward one that prioritizes diplomacy, development, and cooperation with other nations. It means using its influence to promote human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, not just in word, but in deed. The challenges we face are daunting, but not insurmountable. The human capacity for change, for progress, for compassion is boundless. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. so eloquently reminded us. It is up to each and every one of us to bend that arc, to work tirelessly to create a world where exploitation is a relic of the past and where all people have the opportunity to live with dignity, freedom, and hope. The time for action is now. The future of our nation, and indeed the future of our planet, depends on it, and that is why we at Joe Solutions and TimeForChange.com are working hard to make the world safer for generations to come.